Hey, it's Tanya here from Nerdy Knitting. Today we're talking about the seed stitch pattern. We'll learn how to work the pattern, read the instructions and the chart for the pattern, and I'll also share some tips for reading your knitting. If you want to jump to a specific topic, check out the timestamp links in the video description box that's down below. Let's get knitting. Seed stitch is a great sturdy fabric. It lies flat, it's fully reversible. It would be a great border for anything worked in stockinette, which tends to curl. It also looks nice when it's worked in bulky yarn on big oversized cowls and accessories. It's a 2-stitch repeat and a 2-row repeat. Your 2 stitches are simply knit and purl, and you do that across the row. And when you turn the work, you would do the opposite. If you see a knit stitch, you purl it. If you see a purl stitch, you knit it. The first stitch I see on my needle is a purl stitch, so that means I'm going to start with a knit, and I will knit 1, purl 1 across the row. The work is in your left hand, empty needle in your right. The working yarn is in whichever hand is easiest for you to use. So we knit, bring that working yarn to the front between the needles, purl the next stitch, to the back and knit, to the front between the 2 needles and purl. You want to be careful with that working yarn. You don't want to finish your knit stitch and then bring that yarn over the top before you purl. You'll create an accidental yarn over, and that's an extra stitch that you didn't intend to have. So it's important to bring the yarn between the needles, which is pretty easy when you're going from a purl back to a knit. The yarn just goes back that way. Knit the stitch, but when you're going to a purl, make sure you bring it between. Don't put it over the needles. When you're moving from one stitch to another, you always bring the yarn forward and back like that. So we'll knit and purl across the row. So we turn our work, and there's our fabric. Seed stitch should be a fairly firm fabric. You don't want a lot of oversized holes. If you find that you're getting those, then you just need to be careful of the way you're forming your stitches. Let's start this row and I'll show you what I mean. I have a knit stitch here. I can see right there, that little V shows me that that's a knit stitch. So I want to purl that. When I look at this one, I can see it's a purl. That head of the stitch is right there below my needle, so I'm going to knit that one. Now if you're getting holes, it's probably occurring right here when you're coming to the front of the work. If you're coming far apart, you're leaving a lot of slack on that stitch, and then you're making your purl, and you're working loose. Look at all the space I have in there, and look at the size of those stitches. I'm going to have a hole. I don't want that. So after I knit, I don't pull firmly, but I hold it a little tighter than normal, and that takes out some of that extra slack, especially when I'm moving it to the front. I pull it more firmly than normal, and I work that stitch. Then I work my normal knit stitch. I don't let it get really slack though. I keep it close to the needle and bring it forward and work the next stitch. And that will keep your seed stitch from developing any holes. Let's continue working across this row. Here's a tip. My last stitch is a knit stitch. When I turn my work, my first stitch is also going to be a knit stitch. So if you get confused about what the pattern is, just try to remember what stitch you finished with. That's the stitch you're going to start with. Let's take a look at a seed stitch chart. This is what the chart would look like if we charted out this pattern. As you can see, it looks just like our fabric here. Remember, a chart is a visual representation of the front side of your work. So all of those little bumps represent the little purl bumps on the front of our work. It can be worked on an even number of stitches or an odd number of stitches. It's a 2-row repeat. You can see right there you need to work those 2 rows repeatedly to get the pattern. And it's a 2-stitch repeat. If you're going to work it over an even number of stitches, this is what you would work right here. This is your written instructions. That little star tells you that's your repeat. You knit 1, purl 1, and then you repeat that across the length of your work right to the end. And then on the wrong side, you start with a purl. Just like you finished with a purl, you flip your work, you're starting with a purl. And you repeat that pattern. I prefer to use an odd number of stitches because sometimes I don't like to start with a purl stitch on the front of my work. I like to start with a knit stitch. So if I cast on an odd number of stitches, I'm always beginning and ending with a knit stitch on either side of the work. All right, let's just do a little more, and I'm going to share a few more tips for working seed stitch. The first thing is to look at your work. You don't need to follow the chart or follow the written instructions. Once your pattern's established, just follow what's on your needles. And for seed stitch, that means work whatever is the opposite. If you see a purl, you knit it. If you see a knit, you purl it. But what if you can't tell? You need to understand your stitches. Let's take a look at what's happening with this stitch. Here's our stitch. It has 2 legs and it has a head. When you're working stockinette or when you're knitting a stitch, the head of that stitch goes behind the new stitch. When you're purling a stitch, you're pushing that head to the front of the work. So let's say I'm going to knit a stitch. I'm bringing my yarn, I'm inserting my needle, bringing my yarn right through. There's my new stitch. It's pushed the head of that stitch to the back of this new stitch. There's my legs there in the front. That's that little V you see. That's your knit stitch. You can't see the head on a stitch, well you can on this pipe cleaner, but when you're knitting, that head of the stitch is pushed to the back. If you're purling, you're bringing your needle this direction and you're taking the yarn that way. And see what it's doing? The head of that stitch is coming to the front. It lies in the front of the stitch you've just worked. So that you need to apply that to your knitting. When you see that little head right underneath the needle, that's a purl stitch. You can pull it down too and tell. Take a look. Now you can see right here. There's a little bump. That's a purl stitch. Here's a V right here above my thumb. That's a knit stitch. There's a purl bump. There's that little V. That's a knit stitch. Take some time to get to know your work. Ready to get nerdy with your knitting? Click the subscribe button down below.